Online Symposium and Paper Hackathon 2021. We have a very extensive and comprehensive program for this year. And the credit for organizing this comprehensive program goes to Professor Mariana Sigala and Dr. Saman Soleimani and all organizing committee. Thanks to all of them. In this program, we have different panels and discussion. Series of workshop also we have research related workshop. Today we will have 4 parallel workshops that these workshops will start 10:45 in Adelaide time. We will have workshop 1, the art of writing literature review. So it's about systematic review by Professor Justin Powell. Workshop 2 will be on how to prepare manuscript for submission and handle revision to JHTM. This workshop will be conducted by Dr. Edmond Gold, our associate editor. Third workshop is theory in the study of tourism, origins, adaptation, impact, and retirement by Professor Noel Scott. And workshop 4 for first day will be designing quality research from ideas to publication by Associate Professor Dr. Emily Ma, our associate editor in the journal. So this will be a list of workshop, parallel workshop in first day. And in second day, day 2, we will have again 4 workshops that will be started 19:15 in Adelaide time. In second day, first workshop will be on using FSQCA fuzzy set qualitative comparative analysis in quantitative research. I will conduct this workshop and we will discuss about FSQCA in tourism and hospitality and especially linking between FSQCA and quantitative research. A second workshop will be getting your qualitative research published by Julia Albert. Third workshop will focus on qualitative data collection using online hard laddering technique by Dr. Said Rahman. And the fourth workshop will be experimental design and data analysis, tips and tricks, Professor Lawrence Fong. So you can see we have the comprehensive topic and different topics related to research. So based on your interest, you can attend this workshop and benefit from a different workshop. I hope you enjoy all sessions, panels, and workshop during this JHTM Online Symposium and Paper Hackathon 2021. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mustafa. And last but not least, Emily, welcome to our symposium and thank you for your support as well.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you, our editorial members, and thank you, Saman, and thank you, everyone. So it's a nice event. I'm so happy to see this happening. And I want to highlight, draw your attention about another discussion panel on day 2. So from 16:15 in the afternoon, this discussion panel actually draws the leaders from both the industry as well as the academia. So we are focusing on the new normal of tourism research. Facing, the pandemic, we look at opportunities and challenges that will brought by the new normal. So we have industry leaders from the hotel sectors, from also General Manager Emery Belay, and she worked in Australia for a long time, and she also worked in different parts of the world as well. And we also have Dr. Alison Anderson, Professor Joseph Cheer, Dr. Freya, and we also have STR Vice President Steve Hood. So all industry leaders as well as academic leaders, they come together. This session is chaired by Professor Mariana Sigla. And so I'm sure it will be a very interesting discussion, inspiring a lot of ideas that are not only interesting, practically significant, but also have theoretical implications. Please, I also want to draw your attention to, if you're interested, to attend my session in a few hours' time, so featuring designing quality research from ideas to publications. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you, Emily. So as you can see, we are targeting to keep you busy for 2 days, not full days, but half days. I know people are watching us from all over the globe. You probably are in a totally different time zone. But as I mentioned before, we are video recording sessions, so don't get panic or stressed that you probably have to stay late or wake up quite early sometimes. A highlight again, make sure that you copy paste the Zoom links that you can find in your program to ensure that you log into the appropriate session. And I hope you enjoyed it. We have managed to bring a good mixture of scholars and industry. And do not get afraid actually to interact with them or write your question and answers. So without any further ado, I will declare the Online Research Symposium 2021 open, and I will proceed to our first session. It is actually my privilege to welcome on the floor Professor Bob McKercher. He's our distinguished keynote speaker, starting our research symposium. He's actually going to talk about a quite topical topic. He's going to give us some insights and personal expertise in terms of what is going wrong with research studies in special interest markets. What we know or we don't know, or what we should know or research in a different way. Probably, as I mentioned before, everybody has heard of Bob before. I'm sure you have heard and you have read a lot of things about him or for him. Professor Bob McKercher, he joined the University of Queensland quite recently, after having spent about 22 years in the School of Hotel and Tourist Management at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. He actually started his academic career at Charles Sturt University, and prior to that, he worked for about 10 years in the Canadian tourism industry in a variety of operational advocacy and managerial roles. He has received his PhD from the University of Melbourne in Australia and a master's degree from Charleton University in Ottawa, Canada, and his undergraduate degree from York University in Toronto, Canada. He has published numerous papers, more than 300, several research reports. He is the author of, or the co-author of The Business of Nature-Based Tourism, Cultural Tourism, Tourism Theories, Concepts and Models. And he has also edited numerous other books. Professor McKercher is the chairman of the board of the International Academy for the Study of Tourism, and he is a fellow of several associations and organizations. I will just name few: the International Academy for the Study of Tourism, the Council of Australian University Tourism and Hospitality Education, and the International Academy of Culture, Tourism and Hospitality Research. Bob, welcome, and thank you very much for your time and sharing your expertise with you. I'm looking forward for your talk.
Thank you, Mariana. Now, if you could just unclose your screen and I can load up my presentation.
Oops, sorry.
Nope, wrong one. Okay. So thank you, everybody, and thank you, Mariana, and welcome, everybody. And I really want to thank you for inviting me to talk at this symposium. What I'm really going to talk about today is bad research, but it's really bad secondary analysis. This is becoming more and more of an issue as governments are releasing their data sets to academics to study, whether it's the full data set or online data. And also it's becoming,
McKercher.
yes?
We didn't see a correct screen sharing. We saw an email page rather than the PowerPoint. Yeah.
Okay, I should be on screen sharing now. Let me try it again. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. As I said, it's become more of an issue, and it's especially an issue now when we're dealing with data from a variety of sources, when we're talking about big data and we're talking about a whole series of other data that are collected for one purpose and used for another purpose. This is a bit of a passion of mine because I've seen so much bad research that's not just methodologically bad, but that's dangerous. And its only value is the heat it can generate when you burn the research report, rather than the insights gained from the report. So if we can begin by thinking about some questions that maybe challenge how tourism is being taught and being researched these days. And the first one is, have motives really changed? Or do we just have more opportunity to express the same motives through different activities? And the second question is, has the mass market really fractured? Or are we just measuring more and more things in our market research? Now, these are really important questions because we talk about mass individualism today. And we talk about the idea that, especially with smartphones and with the web, that people can design their own itineraries. But that has to be balanced against the fact that we really see a herding effect where people go to popular attractions because they're popular attractions. And all the research that was done by Philip Pierce and many other people who are engaged in motivation research that says there really are some core motives that haven't changed much through time, just the expression of those has changed. Now, my area of interest is in special interest tourism, and it is a really appealing sector for most destinations because every destination should have its own story to tell, and every destination should be able to position itself uniquely in the marketplace. But also from a consumer standpoint, the special interest market is thought to be very appealing. They're thought to be older, better educated, more affluent than the general tourist. They're thought to spend more than the general tourist. They're thought to do more in a destination, and they're believed to stay longer. Now, quite frankly, that's untrue, but there's a lot of accepted research that's published that proves this. And I say prove in quotation marks. And as we go through the presentation, we'll see just how flawed the research is. The other feature about special interest tourism, it's supposed to be huge. World Tourism Organization says 37% of tourists are cultural tourists. If you look at various nature-based studies, between 20 and 60% of global travel is either ecotourism oriented or nature-based tourism oriented. And other studies have shown that 81% of Americans are cultural tourists when they travel in the States, or that 45% of all tourists to South Africa are nature-based tourists, and the list goes on and on and on. But, and this is the but that has caused me a lot of confusion over the years. When you look at global tourism purpose, pleasure tourism represents about 30% of all travel. VFR or personal tourism, almost half of all global travel, and business or other personal, about 20%. So something doesn't add up. If 70% of all trips taken worldwide are for pleasure, or for visiting friends and relatives, business, or for other reasons, then I'm not sure how 37% of all trips can be cultural tourism trips, or how 60% of all trips can be nature-based tourism trips. The numbers just don't make any sense. And so we really have to dig deeply into these numbers. Now, it must be understood that most of the people who do research in special interest areas are fans of the specialist interest, and they want to do research because they really believe it's important, and so they will do what they can to show the research, to show their research to be as important as possible, and to show their specialist interest to be as important to the destination as possible. But the question that has to be asked is, what is really being measured when you say that 37% of all tourists are cultural tourists? Or what is being measured when you say 80% of Americans are interested in cultural tourism? And this comes down to the question of how you conceptualize special interest tourism. Now, special interest tourism is supposed to be the hub around which the total travel experience is planned and developed. So from a research standpoint, special interest tourism conceptually should be why people travel. It should be the trip purpose that directs in whole or in part the total trip experience. But special interest tourism is also product category. And when you look at the research that we've done on cultural tourism, for example, there are about 11 different product categories within the cultural tourism space. Within the nature-based tourism space as well, there are a whole series of different product categories. So when you talk about 37% or 40% or 60%, are you actually talking trip purpose, or are you talking participation in a product category? And so we did some research a few years ago in Hong Kong that compared why people came to a destination versus what they did in the destination. And so we asked them very simply to say, what activities did you participate in? And then from those activities that you participated in, which ones of these caused or influenced your decision to come to Hong Kong? So for business travel, it's pretty much one-to-one. People who participated in business came to Hong Kong to do business. But when you look at a range of other activities, there's quite a huge gap between why people come to a destination and what they do in the destination. So 70% of people ate different types of food than they normally eat at home. You could call them culinary tourists, but only 20% said that they actually came to the destination to eat different food. So there's a 4 times gap. When we look at ecotourism, the gap is 18 times. And in fact, there is no standard gap. There is no common gap. It can be as simple as almost 1-to-1, or it can be as high as 20-to-1. You participate in 20 times more things than what actually drove you to come to the destination. And so that leads to the question of 2 ways to define the market. You can either define the market by what people did in the destination, or you can define the market by why they visited. And this leads to some confusion in use of the English language. We call people cultural tourists because it's a very simple expression. Cultural is the adjective that describes a type of tourist. But when you label people cultural tourists, just the same as business tourists or the same as pleasure tourists, what you're really talking about is trip purpose. When in fact, most of the research and most of the activities that people engage in are general tourists who visit a cultural attraction. So not all tourists are the same. And think about peanut butter as a bad example, but think about why you go into the store to buy peanut butter. Sometimes you're out and you go to the store specifically to purchase peanut butter. Then absolutely you're a peanut butter consumer. Sometimes you write up a shopping list, and on the shopping list it's got a whole range of things, And peanut butter is one of those many things. So the purchase of peanut butter plays a role in part of the overall motive to go to the shop. But many other times you'll be shopping and you'll fill up your cart, and as you walk by the peanut butter stall, say, oh, yeah, peanut butter, I think I'll grab some. So you're an incidental peanut butter shopper. It plays no role in your decision to visit the shop. And some other times it's just purely by happenstance. As you're leaving, there's a stand with peanut butter near the cash out, and you say, oh, okay, I think opportunistically I'll grab peanut butter. Now, if you were trying to sell peanut butter and you looked at the amount of people who purchase peanut butter, you could say, well, this is a critical reason to come to the shop. But in reality, the people who come to the shop in whole or in part to purchase peanut butter is a very small component of the overall market. And that's the same with special interest tourism. The people who pursue special interest tourism in whole or in part as a reason why they visit a destination is a very small part of the overall market. Now, why is so much bad research done? Well, you have to understand how visitor surveys are structured. And you have to understand then how people come up to these misleading figures about the market being huge. And typically, visitor surveys done by national or state tourism organizations have a rigorous sampling method. They've got a rigorous questionnaire. The data are good, but you have to understand what is being asked in the data. And they can consider these aspects. Did you travel? Yes or no? What was the purpose of your trip? And then typically, how long did you stay? Who did you travel with? What activities did you pursue in the destination? And then expenditure satisfaction. And as all good surveys, you finish with the personal details. And this is pretty typical of a trip purpose question. This is from Stats Canada. It's the old Tourism Canada survey, but it's pretty much the same type of trip purpose question that's asked in virtually every national, state, or local tourism survey. And the question is, what was the traveling party's main reason for taking this trip to Canada? Please check one only. For example, if a person on a business trip took his or her family along to visit relatives, check the reason for the trip as business. And then they usually give you a few options, but they asked you to pick one option. Tell me, where's the cultural tourist? Where's the eco-tourist? Where's the golf tourist from this? It's impossible to define them. Then as you progress down the questionnaire, they tend to ask you this type of question. On this trip in Canada, did anyone in your traveling party check all that apply? And they give you a list of anything from 15, 20 items to, in the case of Tasmania, 120 items. And your idea, then you're told to tick all those activities that you apply. Very straightforward. Why did you come to the destination? Choose one reason. What did you do? Pick as many things as you wanted to do. Now, accurately, if you are going to present the activities that people pursued, they should be presented in a string type manner so that the person, one, went shopping, engaged in culinary tourism, went to theme parks. Person 12 did a whole lot more things: shopping, museums, religious, theme parks, beaches, cross-border tourism, etc. But that's not how the data are presented. The data are coded into a spreadsheet with each activity representing a separate variable. And so, did you go shopping, yes or no? Did you engage in culinary tourism, yes or no? Did you visit museums, yes or no, etc. Practically, from a coding standpoint, this is what has to be done, but it gives a very misleading impression of the activities people engaged in, because you pick the single activity that represents your specialist interest, and you analyze that without taking into consideration all the other activities that people engaged in. So this is how Tourism Victoria, and I'm using it as an example, but Tourism Vermont, Tourism Canada, pretty much every other national tourism organization defines their special interest segments this way. Nature-based experiences, you visit national parks, botanic gardens, or other public gardens, you do whale or dolphin watching, you go bushwalking, you go scuba diving. Cultural experience, again, you attend theaters, concerts, performing arts, etc. And when you look at analyzing the activities that people engage in, they do look very impressive. So again, looking through Tourism Victoria's data, 2.2 million international visitors were nature-based tourists. 1.9 million were cultural tourists, and the list continues. And on the basis of this, you could say, well, nature-based tourism is a driving factor that brings people to the state or to our country. But when you look at them in totality, and if you look at these figures as being an inference of trip purpose, well, a very different picture emerges. So again, looking at Tourism Victoria's figures, and I'm choosing Tourism Victoria because its data are available, but it's typical of most other destinations as well where data are available. So yes, 2.2 million international tourists were nature-based tourists, but of 3.35 million overseas visitors to the state, then that represents 2/3 of them. And when you actually look at the share of pleasure tourists of 1.7 million, then all of a sudden you're explaining 129% of arrivals that tourists are nature-based tourists. That's what drives them to visit the destination. And when you look at these 6 single activities of nature-based culture, events, food and beverage, wine, or golf, well, pretty much you're explaining 350% of pleasure tourist arrivals to the state. Now that's ludicrous. If they said that people engage in a whole range of activities when they come to the state, that's one thing. But what they're really inferring is that these activities are actually what drove tourism. Now, why do they do this? Well, the numbers are big. So if the numbers are big, then that gets political support. If the numbers are big, then that also gets support from various stakeholder groups, especially non-tourism stakeholder groups. And the research that we've done on cultural tourism, again, a lot of cultural tourism managers invoke the god of tourism. Sorry, a lot of cultural heritage managers invoke the god of tourism as the reason to conserve cultural heritage. It also gets cooperative marketing money from the industry. If you can say, well, 2/3 of all people are nature-based tourists, well, therefore you must engage in cooperative marketing. But of course, there are some risks. And the big risk is that there's phantom demand. There's a huge difference between somebody who goes for a walk and somebody who's willing to pay a tour operator to take him or her for a walk. There are also risks that you're going to confuse the industry, and there's a risk that people are going to spend scarce marketing resources on markets that really don't exist. And in fact, when the World Tourism Organization says 40 or 60% of tourists are special interest tourists, they've actually revised that and said, no, actually 2% of tourists are eco-tourists. So the method to calculate the size of the market is fundamentally flawed. What you're doing is you're looking at activity and you're trying to infer trip purpose when there is no connection between the two. And in fact, the gap between trip purpose and activity could be as high as 20 times. When you look at all those questions about how do people engage in cultural or heritage or special interest tourism, and why are they better? Why do they spend more? Why are they more engaged? Why do they do more? Well, again, the method is fundamentally flawed. You select all those activities that reflect the specialist interest, and then through a series of simple chi-square tests or t-tests, you compare the differences between the participants and the non-participants. And this is straight from a state in America. It says that this is how we define the activities pursued, the economic benefit of, in this case, cultural tourists, but it works as well for every other special market. An analysis of those respondents who indicated they included cultural heritage activities as part of at least one of their trips to the destination. And in doing so, you can prove that people who go to museums stay longer, spend more, and do more things. And there are lots of consultants who are making lots of money doing bad special interest data analysis by analyzing conclusions, by analyzing activities, and then trying to assert a causal link between what tourists do, how much they spend, or how long they stay. But what's really being analyzed is not a cause and effect relationship. What's really being analyzed is an effect and effect relationship. So the activities pursued are one effective visitation. Another effective visitation is how much are you spending, how long are you staying, what activities are you engaging in, have you bought a local day tour, etc. You cannot show a causal relationship by analyzing the activities pursued in a destination against a whole range of other activities. And yet this is being done, and it's being done continually. But it makes as much sense as this statement. Wearing pajamas causes people to eat more breakfast cereal. Now, there's a correlation between wearing pajamas and eating breakfast cereal, but there's not a causal effect. There are a lot of other factors that play into this, mostly the time of day. But if you were a marketer and you were to go to one of the breakfast cereal companies and say, hey, I've discovered that when people wear pajamas, they eat more breakfast cereal. Let's start a marketing campaign that says, come home from work and put on your pajamas. And all of a sudden we can double breakfast cereal consumption. If you said that, you'd be laughed out of the room. But if you say this, going to a museum causes people to stay longer, spend more, and do more things, you would be hailed as a marketing guru, as a very insightful researcher. And yet, it's as logical as this statement. And in fact, the reason why people do more, people who participate in special interest activities do more, is that they're first-time visitors. And first-time visitors tend to consume destinations widely. They do a lot more things in a destination than repeat visitors. Repeat visitors tend to do fewer things more intensely. The other reason is that the place they're staying is their main destination and not a stopover destination. And so as a main destination, you have a lot more psychological investment in the destination. And so you want to do as much as you can to maximize your experience, but also you stay longer in the destination. And so you have a chance to do more things in the destination. Similarly, if you take a day tour, a sightseeing tour, you're going to visit a lot of things. And when you tick the box, you can say, we tick the box. And in fact, your visit to a temple in Hong Kong may have nothing more to do than it was raining and you wanted to go inside the rain. So the failure to consider alternate explanations and then to instead infer a causal relationship is what leads to terrible, terrible research about the size and importance of special interest markets. And similarly, and I won't spend a lot of time on this because this one gets quite confusing, but when you look at the economic impact of the special interest activities, how is that calculated? Well, again, they tend to look at the total spend of the segment. So people who engaged in nature-based tourism, people who engaged in shopping tourism, people who engaged in cultural tourism, you can pick your own specialist interest. They look at their total spend, but they don't control for other activities that they did. And yet, when people are traveling in a destination, they're incredibly active. This is some research that we've just published about the range of activities that people engage in by dominant theme in Bali. And as you can see, it's almost impossible to ascribe total expenditure or total economic benefit to one activity. Now, I'll briefly explain this table. The purple column is the activities they engaged in. This is the number of people. There's a second column. But the third column is a number of discrete activities. So if somebody went to a beach, of the 563 people who went to a beach, 553 of them engaged in different groups of activities in Bali. Whether it's some went to the beach, well, they all went to the beach, but some might have gone shopping, some might have gone to a temple, some might have gone to rice terraces. In fact, it's almost 100% of different movement patterns that tourists engaged in when they went into Bali. And this goes back to something Neil Leeper talked about 30 years ago, about how we each have our own individual tourism system. There's no such thing as a single tourism system. We have individual tourism systems that overlap in certain places, but each tourist behaves uniquely or differently. And so how can you then say, because people went to a beach, this is how much they spent in Bali? Or because people visited the rice terrace, this is how much they spent in Bali, when virtually everybody who went to rice terraces did different things than virtually everybody else who went to rice terraces. And in fact, if you were to control for these activities, the math becomes almost impossible. If you have 10 activities in a survey, then you have a total of 1,023 possible combinations of activities that you need to control for. If you're surveying 20 people, then you've got over 1 million, sorry, if you're surveying about 20 activities, then you've got over 1 million different possible combinations. How can you then isolate one activity as being the cause of the economic impact? So the bad tourism research on special interest markets, but bad tourism research I'm also seeing using big data ignores the basic rules of secondary data. And secondary data is really useful. I've done a lot of research with it. There are lots and lots of opportunities to use secondary data, but you have to understand the 4 key principles. And the 4 key principles are this: that it's reliable, that the data can provide consistent results. And again, when you're using big data or national or state or even local survey data, it's probably pretty reliable. Is it sensitive? Is there fine enough detail for the purpose of the research? Again, probably yes. But is it fit? Are the data that's collected for one purpose relevant, timely, and suitable for another purpose? And are they valid? Can the data predict a criteria? Most of the bad research using secondary data fails the fitness and validity test. Data collected to understand what people do in a destination is not suitable to understand why people came to a destination. People are incredibly active when they participate. They do a lot of things, as a couple of researchers in Finland have pointed out, that yes, they have priorities they want to see, but many other things are just to fill in time or to add value to the trip. And are they valid? Can the instrument predict a criterion? So can the fact that you went to a temple or that you went whale watching, can that predict your length of stay, your expenditure, your range of other activities? And the answer is no. And to do this is not only dangerous because it fails to recognize the reason that the data were collected, but it produces grossly inflated and grossly misleading numbers that cause businesses to go into business when no market opportunity exists and they struggle. It causes destinations to waste their money targeting markets that don't exist, and it causes consumers to be a little bit confused about the experience. So the standard method used to define special interest markets is fundamentally flawed methodologically. The instrument does not provide the data that are fit for purpose. It can't define valid segments, and it can't show causality. The only way that you can look at special interest markets is to actually test for trip purpose and not test for activities. So with that, I'd like to thank you for giving me a chance to talk. And I think we have a little bit of time if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask or any comments that they'd like to share. So I'll stop sharing the screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bob, for the really critical overview of the topic and the very illustrative examples you gave. We do have time for questions, so I would like to open the floor. Feel free to type in your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and I'll try to moderate and go through as many as we have time for answers and questions. Bob, if I may.
Yes.
I really liked your example. I think it's very interesting with this pajama issue, but I think we need to start being careful how we are using it, because COVID has changed many things, as you know. We wear pajamas not only in the morning. Due to the lockdowns, people were wearing pajamas all day, 24 hours per day. So I think the correlation that we used to find doesn't exist anymore between pajamas and cereal.
Could be true. So this is a pre and a post-COVID example.
Yes, we need to update our examples in the post-COVID era.
Right. So the question is, how should cause and effect in cultural data be surveyed? Sorry, cultural tourism be surveyed? Well, it's very simple. Idaho does it right. Hong Kong is starting to learn. Australia is still learning. Most other countries are still learning. You ask people what their primary purpose for coming to the destination was, and then you ask them if there were any other reasons that played a role in whole or in part in coming to the destination. And if they pick culture, if they pick heritage, if they pick nature-based, etc., then you would then be able to say, well, this number of people came in whole or in part as cultural tourists, and therefore they are cultural tourists according to the trip purpose criterion. And then you could separate their activities and look at their activities. We did some research looking at, as I said, tourists are engaged in many things. we looked at all of the data we collected on different activities that people participated in and did a whole series of tests. We looked at 21 different specialist interest activities, and we found that on average, there were between 15 and 20 statistically significant differences in expenditure, length of stay, trip party composition, other activities pursued, et cetera, across all of these activities. And all this means is that tourists are different. Tourists behave quite skedastically, quite randomly. So the fact that you find significant differences in one specialist interest doesn't mean anything, because if you divide up the market, you can always find specialist groups that behave statistically significantly differently. What you really need to do is say, well, what is the most meaningful group, and how can we have confidence that we've identified this group?
There is one question about the word special in the definition of this type of tourist. And what does it mean? If many people join the group, why is it special? And if you do many activities, what's the special activity?
That's a really good question. And special interest tourism grew out of this whole anti-tourism or anti-mass tourism genre, so that you had mass tourism that everybody engages in, special interest tourism that hopefully people with specialist interests engage in. And again, if you look at it as a trip purpose, that makes sense. Even my dogs are disagreeing. But if you look at it as an activity, well, people engage in a whole range of things. But what you really need to do is to drill down to why they came to the destination. I'll give you a very simple example. A former student of mine's from Bangkok, and she invited us to her wedding. So we went to Bangkok to go to the wedding. But when we were in Bangkok, we went shopping, went dining, we visited some other friends, we visited some heritage sites, we did some nature-based tourism activities, we did a whole range of things. But why did we go to Bangkok? If it wasn't for the fact of this wedding, we wouldn't have gone and we wouldn't have engaged in all these other activities. So if you look at special interest as the purpose why you're going to the destination, you can ask the question, if not for this activity, would I be in this destination at this point in time? And that's really when you can do some good research to understand the true importance of the activity in your overall trip purpose.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for this example and explanation, Bob. It relates to what I was going to ask as well. To what extent context, as you described before, the context that you're going for a wedding, influence the activities that you do, or the activity that is the driving purpose to go to a trip? And how do we use context as a way of researching the special interest tourist?
And again, this is something that I think we've relied too much on generic data, and I'm going to get in trouble here. We've relied too much on structural equation modeling that assumes the market's homogeneous without really recognizing that there are discrete groups in the market, that you really have to go and talk to the tourist. We've done some research, for example, that has asked the questions, do attractions actually attract tourists? Are they the reason they come to the destination, or are they the backdrop to have other needs met? Now, for some groups, they are, but for many other groups, they're just the excuse for the family to spend some time together. And that's really what drives them to come to the destination. Or they're the excuse to capture icon attractions if you are a fairly new tourist and you're still learning how to travel. What we need to do more and more is actually talk to the tourist. And I like this. And I like the idea that you're going to be focusing on qualitative research, because it's so easy to play with big numbers that we forget that tourism involves you and me making an individual decision to travel and making an individual decision to do things. And we need to be able to drill down into those individual decisions.
Mm-hmm. There is a question from the floor, and this relates to what type of research methods should we be employing to investigate this further? Should we migrate from quantitative to qualitative studies? And how should we do it better?
Well, I'm a guy who believes in mixed method studies, and I've used some big data analysis. I've used a lot of GIS analysis, and that explains the what people do. But you then need to ask the more qualitative questions to understand the why people behave the way they behave. So I believe that we should do more mixed method research. Now, this is hard because there's so much pressure to publish now, and there's so much pressure to churn out papers that I could spend hours talking about slicing and dicing research to get the minimum publishable piece of work. But most of that work is unread and unreadable. And you're much better off doing one or two quite deep pieces of research that really come up with some insights that add to our body of knowledge about how tourists work, instead of just doing superficial number crunching.
Mm-hmm. Another question relates to, do we also need to prioritize the motivation and the purpose of people? Have you seen any research doing that? Or what's the benefit of doing it?
Well, Philip Pierce's started as his travel career ladder that became the travel career pattern that talks about 3 layers of motives, I think is really insightful. And much more research can be done looking at the balance between the different layers of motives. I think also, again, simply if you're doing a survey, by asking the trip purpose question of what influenced you in whole or in part to come to this destination, can really provide some valuable insights into understanding tourist behavior. So instead of giving them just a box to tick, ask an open-ended question. What activity in whole or in part caused you to come to this destination?
Mm-hmm. And the last question relates to how can we determine the trip purpose? Would it be enough to have a self-declaration, or we need more in-depth research?
Again, it depends on what your research purpose is. If you want to compare business and pleasure tours, then a simple binary question is fine. But really, what's most important is why people come to a destination, less so than what they do in a destination. Because your challenges, especially in these days of increasing competition, and as COVID especially starts to ease, there's going to be intense competition to get people to the destination. Once they're in the destination, then you can load them up with lots of activities, but you've got to get them to the destination. So understanding the trip purpose and the causal effect that brings them to the destination is much more important than understanding the behavior in the destination.
Yeah, that's very true, because there are also different factors affecting that, isn't it? I mean, it's price availability, isn't it? I mean, if there are more frequent flights or cheaper flights to go to a destination, you know, this has totally nothing to do with what is the activity that you do there in some
No,
way.
and as almost 40 years ago, John Crompton said the destination is actually irrelevant depending on what your motives are. If your desire is just to escape, have a break, spend some time with family, the destination becomes irrelevant. You can do that almost anywhere. So things like cost, time, hotels, that plays the role in the destination visitation reason. If your purpose is much more specialized, in my case, going to Bangkok because of a wedding, then there's a whole different set of factors that come into play.
Beautiful. So I think there is okay. One more question and I will stop it here, because I think people have bombarded you a lot. Are you able to read that, Salai?
Is this thank you
Any
for
suggestions for the early career or mid-career researchers?
Oh, I've got lots of suggestions for early career, mid-career researchers. The rules have changed so much from when I started. You know, when I started 30 years ago, you needed a master's degree in industry experience to get a senior lecturer's position in Australia. Now you need a doctorate and an impressive publications position just to get a lecturer's position. So it's hard, but my advice for early and mid-career researchers, find your passion, because this is a great life. If it's just a job, it's a terrible job, but it's a great life if it's a life. Specialize in a couple of areas, but learn how to write papers on your own or as the lead author with a very small one, maybe two other authors. What's happening now, as I see, is rather than research being a craft that you learn, that especially early career researchers are stuck in teams where they do one thing and they never really learn how to advance beyond that one thing. And as long as they're collaborating with others, mostly more senior researchers who can do the rest of the work to get it publishable ready, then they'll look like they've got a fairly impressive research profile. But as soon as they stop working with that researcher, they're lost. So spend the time and learn the craft. And there's nothing wrong with single authored papers. There's nothing wrong with double authored papers. But once you start to get into 4, 5, or 6 authors, you really have to wonder what contribution the other authors are making. So focus. Oh, I guess there's one more thing, and I'm going to be talking at another university about this. And the last comment is, have fun and never work weekends.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks for the doggy as well. We haven't seen him or her, but he kept us company as well.
Yes, thanks, Mariana.
I appreciate it. So I will close the session here. Please don't forget that we start the next one, which is the discussion panel about research originality. And we are actually hosting a lot of journal editors sharing their opinion about this. Take a breath, have a drink, use the toilet, I don't know, go out for a while, and we will see you again in 15 minutes. Thanks again, and thank you, Bob, and everyone for the welcoming keynote speech to our online symposium. See you soon.